Welcome to Rock and Roll High School, your choice for in-depth and personal conversations with the most legendary artists in the history of contemporary music. Come with us as we explore the albums and songs that have become the soundtrack of our lives. Here's your host, Pete Ganbarg.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rock and Roll High School. My guest this week is Scottish-born singer-songwriter Al Stewart. Most well-known for his run of hits in the 70s like Year of the Cat, Time Passages, and Song on the Radio, Al pretty much single-handedly invented the genre of historical folk rock, weaving real-world events into cinematic tapestries of song. From his earliest solo work, backed by the likes of Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, and Richard Thompson, to his desire to write about things that have never been written before, our conversation covers Al's life and career and is a fascinating look at an artist who is truly unlike anyone else we've ever had on this podcast. Al released his first album over 50 years ago and is still going strong with more tour dates scheduled for 2025 than he's ever had before. Make sure you check out the show when it comes close to where you are and get ready for a great conversation with Al Stewart.
Time passages, yes, go falling in the fading light. Time passages, buy me a ticket on the last train home tonight.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rock and Roll High School. My guest today, very happy to have with us from Arizona, Al Stewart. Hi, Al.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. So next year, Al, you've got a big birthday coming, and one that you're celebrating with a farewell tour of the UK with your current collaborators, the Empty Pockets. That's going to happen in late 2025. You have some US tour dates coming with Livingston Taylor and with our former podcast guest from the Zombies, Colin Blunstone, earlier in 25. So to start things off, I must ask you by quoting one of your songs. So there's a lyric that you wrote from the song Time Passages. Well, I'm not the kind to live in the past. The years run too short and the days too fast. So you wrote those lyrics over 45 years ago. Today, we're recording this in very late 2024. Do you look back? Do you look forward? Both?
Well, I think that those particular lyrics were ironic, obviously. I live in the past. I mean, one of my passions is history. So when I wrote those words, I was like kind of doing a mental wink at the listener, you know, like that saying, you know, I'm fooling with you, right?
Well, you talk about being a bit of a historian, and it's very interesting if you study your catalog, where you've made, if my calculations are correct, you've made 16 original studio albums, 4 live albums. The first 4 studio albums that you made were traditional singer-songwriter albums where you wrote songs about love and romance and relationships. Later on your Past, Present, and Future album, you changed. And like you said, you are a historian. And that album was the first album where you started writing songs about history. And for anyone who is doubting Al Stewart's historian bona fides, let me mention some of the subjects that you've written about.
Okay.
You've written about the Wehrmacht's invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II. You've written about the 16th century English Admiral Sir Richard Lord Grenville. You've written about the escape of the Shah of Iran during the Iranian Revolution. You've written about the killing of the 18th century French political theorist Jean-Paul Marat. You've written about Nazi criminals hiding in South America. So no one listening should doubt the fact that Al knows what he's talking about.
Well, you'd hope so.
So we're going to talk about all that, but let's start in the beginning. You were born in 1945 in Scotland, but you grew up in Dorset in England. And your dad was a flight lieutenant in the RAF Reserve, and he died in a plane crash during a training exercise before you were born. So what do you remember about growing up with your mom and the rest of the family, and how did music enter your life?
Well, what I remember was beans on toast. I don't know if Americans eat Heinz baked beans, but there was rationing after World War II. Basically, we didn't have butter. I didn't see a fruit until I was 13. The rationing was really severe. And so every day I would eat beans on toast. I mean, my mother would take a piece of bread. She would open a can of Heinz baked beans and put them on the toast, and that was what I lived on. That's what I remember mostly. Oddly enough, I developed a lifelong passion for beans on toast. In fact, I think I still eat it. But growing up in England at that period of time with rationing was Keith Richards said the most interesting thing to me about that period. He said, here's the reason why all English rock stars are skinny and pale. It's all to do with diet. Now, I looked around and Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, David Bowie, me, they're all skinny, pale people because of our diet. We didn't have any food. You basically lived on just a handful of things. I mean, like I wouldn't see a hamburger until I came to America. It's just that period of time where nobody was eating anything that was sensible. And if you look at all the English rock stars of that period, they're all skinny and pale, and it's because of our lack of nutrition.
When did music start entering your life back then? Do you remember?
Yeah, my mother's records, I would start hearing things on the radio. They weren't interesting to me particularly. Doris Day was very popular, I think. And so I think one of the things I heard was, I don't know, How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, which I think was Patti Page, actually, not Doris Day, but I'm not sure. But the first thing that really, really, really affected me was when rock and roll started.
And this is the rock and roll of the English variety. Lonnie Donegan, Hank Marvin and the Shadows.
Absolutely.
Artists like that later leading to Eddie Cochran, Duane Eddy. Talk about that and how that influenced your early musical appreciation.
Yeah, Lonnie Donegan was my first hero, and he was everybody's first hero, actually, in England. He made a record called The Rock Island Line in 1954. By 1956, he was probably the most popular artist in Britain. Here's something that Billy Bragg told me, and Billy is pretty great at this stuff. He said in 1956, there were, I think he said 5,000 guitars were sold in England. It was a very small number, and they were mostly sold to people who were trying to sing cowboy songs. By the end of 1957, the number had been up to 250,000, and that's all Lonnie Donegan.
Wow.
What matters about this is that the people who were influenced by him, Jimmy Page was in a skiffle group, the Beatles, John Lennon met Paul McCartney while he was doing a skiffle group thing. All the people who were influenced by skiffle and by Lonnie Donegan became the British Invasion.
Right.
There would be no British Invasion without Lonnie Donegan.
Right.
And no one in America, for some reason, understands this, and it's a mystery to them, but it all comes from that.
Right, and Hank Marvin as well, where you've mentioned in some previous interviews that Lonnie Donegan was the source of the Nile vocally, yeah. Hank Marvin was the source of the Nile musically, and those came together for that generation of young, budding musicians.
And I'm not saying it. Go back and listen to Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton or any of those people. They'll all tell you it all comes from Hank Marvin.
So you started, your first group was a skiffle group, right?
Yeah.
And the famous radio presenter in the UK, Tony Blackburn, was a bandmate of yours, right?
Yes. I was in his band. I was the lead guitar player.
And then fast forward decades and decades and decades later, you were given a Lifetime Achievement Award at the BBC Radio 2 Folk Awards in 2017, presented by your former bandmate, Tony Blackburn.
Yes, and I couldn't resist. I mean, because I have a sense of humor. And so when Tony was giving me the award, I said to him, is it too late to get the band back together?
Hopefully he has a sense of humor.
Well, I'm not sure he does. But
There's a great anecdote from when you were around 17 years old, and you and your buddy Johnny disguise yourselves at a Beatles gig as the quote-unquote men from the Rickenbacker Guitar Company, and
Yes.
you fake your way backstage and you actually meet John Lennon.
Well, I not actually met John Lennon. I convinced him to bring his guitar out and let me play it. I mean, in this day and age, everyone has a cell phone. I'd have a picture of it, but of course, like this is 1963, and I don't. But I've got John Lennon's Black Rickenbacker that was in A Hard Day's Night, and I'm playing it to John Lennon backstage.
So did John Lennon for a second believe that you were and your buddy were men from Rickenbacker?
Oh, he didn't care. In those days, the Beatles were doing a 6-night stand at a theater in Bournemouth. And, so they play the first show and then, they have to have a break before they play the second show. And, he's got nothing to do. It was actually Billy J. Kramer's 21st birthday party that night. So they were celebrating that.
That's funny.
But Lennon just wanted to be amused, and I'm amusing. So,
well, didn't he ask you what you thought of the first show?
yes, he did, and I ruined a Beatle concert. You must know the story.
Well, please tell us.
It's probably the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I was sitting directly in front of George Harrison's amplifier. And so, in those days, the speaker cones, they didn't spread out. They went straight in your face. And the concert was fantastic. The Beatles were absolutely amazing, but I was hearing a lot of George. And I wasn't hearing much of John because he was over on one side. Lennon asked me, what did I think of the concert? And what can I say? I said it was fantastic. It was absolutely great, but I couldn't hear you because all I could hear was George. And the next thing I hear is Lennon saying, "Bloody George!" And he's mad. And I go home, and our local paper is the Bournemouth Echo. I sleep. I try to sleep. I mean, I've just met the Beatles. I've just played John Lennon's guitar backstage. So it's very difficult to sleep. Didn't wake up until probably 11 o'clock the next morning. We've got the Bournemouth Echo, and there it is, and it's got a review. And the review said, the Beatles, fantastic. They are the best band in the world. We love them, we love them, we love them. The first show was great. The second show, unfortunately, John Lennon played so loud, we couldn't hear the rest of the show. Reading the paper, it's 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm in a 400-year-old thatched cottage out in the middle of the New Forest, and I thought, I did that. I ruined a Beatle concert.
There you go. That was probably your first claim to fame right there.
Greatest claim to fame.
There you go. So how did your influences musically evolve from Lonnie Donegan and Skiffle to Bob Dylan, who, as you discovered, the first person to show you Bob Dylan actually pronounced his name Bob Dylan?
Yes, that's true. They're all story songs. Basically, they're lyric-based story songs, which I immediately adopted. I only have two rules about songwriting. One is write about things that no one else has written about, German invasion of Russia or whatever, it's like things that other people wouldn't write about. And the other thing is use language that doesn't appear in any other popular music song. So, think Leonard Cohen or more recently Joanna Newsom, for example. They don't use the same language as anyone else in popular music. When I first heard Joanna Newsom, I was listening to one of her songs and I heard the word spelunking, And I said, I'm going to like this person.
So I read that what inspired you about Bob Dylan is not only was he using unique language, but a direct quote from you was he couldn't sing and he couldn't play either. So you thought that there was some hope for you because you fancied yourself a lyricist, not necessarily a guitar player where you've called yourself a failed Keith Richards. But if Bob Dylan was able to keep did you see a Royal Albert Hall show for 2 hours? And he just kept the audience wrapped with 2 hours of vocal and acoustic guitar, right?
Yeah, you've got to understand in 1963, 64, 65, rock bands, the Beatles, when I saw them, played for probably 25 or 30 minutes. And like I said, Billy J. Kramer was on before, and there was probably a comedian and maybe a juggler or something. I mean, they were variety shows, essentially. And when I first saw Bob Dylan, he played for 2 hours with just an acoustic guitar at the Royal Albert Hall, and you could have heard a pin drop. And I thought, as Bob Dylan would go on to say later, something is happening here, and you don't know what it is.
Right, right. Right, but I think that you as a musician found new inspiration in what he was doing versus what Lonnie Donegan was doing. And then you also found inspiration when you moved up to London and you lived in the same London apartment building in 1965 that occasionally housed other visiting songwriters, and your neighbor for a while was Paul Simon.
Yeah, Paul lived in the next room. That was really interesting because I could hear him writing songs through the wall. And as any songwriter will tell you, when you've just written a song, the first thing you want to do is to play it to anyone who happens to be around. Now, I'm sure, I was 19, I'm sure Paul thought I was like an idiot, I didn't know anything. But he still needed to play his new song to someone. And of course, I was the only one there. Funny story, he began writing Homeward Bound on the platform of Crewe railway station. It was somewhere up north, but he finished it in the room next to me. So he came out and he said, I've written this new song. And it's like, okay, play it. So he plays to me Homeward Bound. And what do I think of it? I thought, it's okay. It's pretty. It's a pretty song. I wasn't knocked out. The very next day, literally the next day, he wrote a song called Richard Cory. They say Richard Cory owns one half of this whole town with political connections to spread the wealth around. Well, we had a 3-hour argument about that because another singer-songwriter was there at the time, was a guy called Jackson C. Frank, who wrote Blues Run the Game. And Jackson said, no. He said, rich people don't spread. Paul had written to spread his wealth around. And Jackson said, no, it should be to spread the wealth around because that's what a rich person would say. So this argument then goes on forever. At the end of it, I was just thrilled with that song. I thought Richard Cory was fantastic. And I told Paul, I said, that's the best song I've heard this year. That's an incredibly great song. That thing you wrote yesterday, whatever it was, Homeward Bound, throw that one away because Richard Cory is going to be a hit. That began, I would say, a lifetime inability to spot commercial music.
Right. You famously would later throw your song Year of the Cat as the last song in the sequence of the Year of the Cat album because you didn't want it to get in the way of the good stuff.
I'm not commercially minded when it comes to songs. I mean, I'm basically, I'm not even a songwriter in a way. I suppose I am, but not in a musical sense. To me, music is one small element of songwriting. I love history. I love movies. I love literature. All these things are equally important to me. I mean, it's the actual song is comprised of all of these things. I don't think of the song as a song first. I think of what is it about and how can I propel it into another dimension by using lyrics.
Well, you've said that you would be a novelist, but you're too lazy.
Yes, that's true. I'd be a basketball player, but I'm just...
The other thing you've said about your songs is that you liken them to mini movies.
They are movies, yeah. Because movies are, I mean, I probably watch a movie every day. I mean, I probably have done for most of my life. And so they're very cinematic. I think Year of the Cat, for example, just taking that one, is a movie. Well, of course, it starts on a morning from a Bogart movie.
We're going to get to that in a second. But I would argue that that song is not only lyrically cinematic, but it's musically cinematic with the parts and the arrangement and the brilliant production by Alan Parsons, which we'll get to in a second. But let's go back to London in the mid-'60s, and you find yourself settled right in the middle of a burgeoning folk scene. In London, there's a folk club called La Cuisine that is a folk and blues club in the basement of a restaurant in Soho. And you almost served as a master of ceremonies with some of the great folk singers coming out of that same scene, like Cat Stevens, Van Morrison, Ralph McTell, people like that. What do you remember about La Cuisine and that scene of your fellow folk singers?
Well, it was initially, when it opened, it was run by a guy called Phil. They decided they would have these things called all-nighters. So the club would run from midnight to 6 o'clock in the morning on Fridays and midnight to 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays. Now, Phil had this very attractive blonde girlfriend, and there was no way he was going to spend the entire weekend in a basement in Soho putting people on stage. So I got to know him, and he said, okay, look, someone has to run the club and be, as you said, the MC. You know, do you want the job? I'll pay you £3 a night. I did want the job. I said, I'm going to meet everybody in the world. It's going to be fantastic. I'm naturally chatty, and it just came naturally to me. So I became the MC at the Cousins and put all those people that you mentioned on stage. I adored it. I thought it was absolutely great. I would give everybody 3 songs, apart from Cat Stevens, who only knew 2 when I met him. His name at the time was Steve Adams, so he told me, although he had a Greek name originally. And it was crazy. I mean, like one day he came in. I don't know if your audience know what 45s are, but they were, like little gramophone records that ran at 45 RPM. When you bought one, they came in a little white paper bag. And so Steve comes in and he says, I've made a record. I say, you can't have made a record. You only know 2 songs. You're like, no one's ever heard of you. And he said, well, I have. I've made a record. All right, you've made a record. Show me. No, I can't. You'll laugh. Why will I laugh? Well, the record company changed my name. Changed your name? You already had 2 names. Now you've got a 3rd one. This is crazy. And so it took half an hour for me to coax him into showing me the record. And he said, you'll laugh. I said, I won't laugh. Just show me the record. Well, his song was called I Love My Dog. That was his first single. And he says, well, they changed my name to Cat Stevens. Dog, cat. And I can't believe this. Show me the record. So he pulls it out. It's on Decca, the English record label. Sure enough, it says I Love My Dog by Cat Stevens. And of course, I did laugh.
All the pay I need comes a-shining through his eyes. I don't need no cold water to make me realize that I love my dog as much as I love you. You may fade, my dog will always come through. Na, 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 na.
And then it became a hit.
Well, you too would record your first solo single for Decca in 66 called The Elf with Jimmy Page, who you mentioned earlier, on guitar. You were 21 years old.
Then with the magic of the elves, my fingers danced among themselves. My heart with lightness thus endowed formed melodies I know not how. And song played the whole night long. Thus he danced and laughed through the night, and with grey morning light he was gone.
but you got your first real record deal with CBS out of the UK, and not because CBS was interested in you, but rather because they wanted to sign another group that your manager also worked with called the Piccadilly Line, and your manager said, no Al Stewart, no Piccadilly Line.
Yeah, it's true. Only reason I got the record contract. And it was a weird thing because that first album that I made for CBS, it sold 2,701 copies. Yeah, I'm very mathematically minded. I am. I can do all kinds of math in my head. So they wanted to drop me. And we'd signed a weird deal whereby we'd signed not to the A&R department, but to the financial department. Don't ask me why. Turned out to be brilliant because CBS would have dropped me after that album. But my manager at the time, Roy Guest, decided not to tell them we were making another album. He just sent the bills for the recording to the finance department, and they paid them.
There you go.
And the A&R department at CBS didn't know that I was actually making a second album. They were shocked. I mean, until we delivered it, we said, okay, here's the second album. What second album?
That's funny. So that second album is called Love Chronicles, and it was released in 1969. And probably one of the more memorable parts of that album is the title cut, which is 18 minutes in length. And it is literally your love chronicles, and it tells the story of your relationships, but it also features a very recognizable Jimmy Page wailing on guitar. I was listening to this song the other day, and it's almost like a Zeppelin track breaks out in the middle, in the middle of this narrative folk song. You have also John Paul Jones on bass and members of Fairport Convention, including Richard Thompson under the pseudonym Marvin Prestwick, playing on that album. And Love Chronicles, you've said, was inspired by some of the French existentialists that you were reading at the time. And was that something that you read and inspired you to kind of spill your soul in a confessional way, like a Love Chronicles 18-minute song?
Well, I always wanted to be a lyric writer. I guess that's what I am. I was deep into the French existentialist writers at the time. Big fan of Jean-Paul Sartre, big fan of Albert Camus. I liked Simone de Beauvoir. I even read Jean Genet, which is kind of hard to go through. I was just basically writing as a fan of literature, especially with Sartre. I mean, there's a Monty Python skit, I think, whereby Sartre looks out the window and he writes whatever he sees, And I was trying to emulate that with writing about my love life.
So I followed her into the black lands, where the window frames peel and flake, and the old Jewish face behind the lace, peeping out trying to get to see what's cooking. Just John the Baptist in the park getting late, thinking there's no one looking. And it's 80 degrees and I'm down on my knees in Brooklyn.
A year later, you play at the first ever Glastonbury Festival at its debut live event in 1970 with 1,000 people only. Glastonbury is now the largest and most renowned European outdoor festival. What I didn't realize is that your gig playing the first ever Glastonbury was overshadowed by a somber moment that Jimi Hendrix had died the same day.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, everybody was very depressed about that. It was just a little festival in a field. Here's something I should never say, because I was invited back for the 25th anniversary and I was invited back for the 40th anniversary. What I didn't tell them is that I wasn't booked. They'd booked a folk singer called Keith Christmas. And I just went along with Keith. And at some point he said, oh, get on stage and help me sing the chorus to the song he was singing. And it gave me a tambourine. So there's a picture of me on stage playing the tambourine and singing. But I was never booked there. I was just going along with Keith to, look after him. Because the picture appeared in the paper, they assumed that, I'd actually been booked there, which is why they brought me back for the, two subsequent anniversaries, but No one ever booked me at Glastonbury in
That's so
1970.
funny. And no need to correct them when they called you back for the 25th and the 40th, right?
Right, believe me, I didn't correct them.
So you released 4 singer-songwriter albums until your writing style shifted, like we mentioned, with your 5th album, Past, Present, and Future. None of those 4 albums was initially released in America. At this point, America has nothing to do with it. You make Past, Present, and Future your 5th album, and it immediately outsells the first 4 albums combined.
Yeah.
And so for you, you're like, okay, well, I get it. Now there's got to be room for one historical folk rock singer in the world, and it's going to be me.
It's going to be me. David Bowie has this great quote, which I've always loved. After Ziggy Stardust, he becomes this enormous star. And an interviewer said to him, how does it feel? Like that now you're like a world phenomenon, you're a major star. And David looked at the interviewer and he said, it's got to be someone. It might as well be me.
There you go.
And I felt the same way. I thought a lot of people in the world like history, and nobody's doing it. I mean, it's got to be someone. It might as well be me.
There you go. And you've said that your first 4 albums were the apprenticeship and that the Past, Present, and Future album was your thesis.
Yes, I think that's true.
Almost like you're coming out. On the album, it includes the song Nostradamus, where Nostradamus was a little too long for mainstream radio airplay. It was 9 minutes and 43 seconds. But unlike your first 4 albums, this album does become available in America, and Nostradamus becomes a hit on many American college radio stations and some of the more progressive FM radio stations, which were flexible about running time. So all of a sudden, you're developing a new audience in America.
A king shall fall and put to death by the English Parliament shall be fire and plague to London come in the year of 6 and 23. An emperor of France shall rise who will be born near Italy. His rule cost his empire dear, Napoleon his name shall be.
Nostradamus and Roads to Moscow, I think, got a fair amount of airplay, but only on limited stations. Now, there's a station in Seattle, that was at the time called KZOK, FM station, and they started playing Roads to Moscow. And in, I think, 76 or 77, they had a listener poll where the listeners voted for, their favorite songs. And I looked at this poll and I was shocked and really impressed that Year of the Cat was, I think, at number 87. I thought, I'm in the top 100. KCOK. Then I absentmindedly looked at the top of the poll to see what the most famous, what the favorites of the listeners were. And number 1 and number 2 were Stairway to Heaven and Layla, which you'd expect at that period in time in the late 70s. That makes sense. Number 3 was Roads to Moscow.
In the footsteps of Napoleon, the shadow figures stagger through the winter, falling back before the gates of Moscow, standing in the wings like an avenger. And far away behind their lines, the partisans are stirring in the forest, coming unexpectedly upon their outposts, growing like a promise.
Which didn't make any sense.
It made no sense to me whatsoever. Apparently, this radio station had been playing it like round the clock. I thought, okay, every other radio station in America played Year of the Cat. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if they played Roads to Moscow instead.
Well, let's talk about Roads to Moscow for a second, because we talked about your historical accuracy. Did you actually take 4 years to write Roads to Moscow to make sure that you told the story correctly and to get all of the historical detail absolutely right?
Yeah, I read 50 books to write that song.
50 books?
Yeah, and I did my research. I read Solzhenitsyn and Koestler and Guderian's memoirs and Zhukov's memoirs. I read everything.
You know what's crazy is that I listened to an interview you did where when you're so historically accurate like that and you do the research of reading 50 books for one 8-minute song, that when you turn on the television and there's a film or a TV show about that period, you immediately know everything they got wrong.
Yeah. I got one thing wrong myself. I put Henry Plantagenet into a song when I should have gone with Henry Tudor. So that's my worst mistake.
And did somebody call you out on that?
Oh, yeah, they do all the time. And you know why I did it? Was because I asked Paul Simon one time, why did you put Joe DiMaggio into Mrs. Robinson? And he said, I needed the syllables. And that was his answer. And Plantagenet, I mean, I needed those syllables. Tudor didn't cut it, so.
Poetic license, you know?
I know, but I got it in the neck after that because it's a stupid mistake and I shouldn't have done it.
Mea culpa. But so your first 4 albums, like we said, were not released in America. That changed with Past, Present, and Future, which was released on a very small American label called Janus. So Janus, I guess, started promoting or at least sending the records out to some radio stations, which is why KZOK in Seattle had the album to start playing Roads to Moscow. But there was also a radio station in Philadelphia called WMMR who everywhere else in America where you came over for your first tour, you'd be playing to maybe 50 people. But in Philadelphia, because of the support you were getting on MMR, it was a zoo.
Yes, that's how I got my manager, Luke O'Reilly, who'd been a disc jockey on MMR. So that's how that came about.
So shortly after that, you changed producers and enter Alan Parsons, who our listeners may know as the titular head of the Alan Parsons Project as an artist, but also famously as the great engineer of Pink Floyd at Abbey Road, all those things. But you met Alan Parsons because you bonded over wine, and that is something that fans of yours know, but our listeners may not know that you are an enophile and you've actually made a record that was almost commissioned to you to write an entire album with a narrative woven through wine. But talk about meeting Alan Parsons, and it seems like that conversation, you were more passionate about wine, and then as a casual aside, hey, would you want to make a record for me one day? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it took 5 seconds. I am actually, well, in French, un maître conseil en vin de France, which means a master counselor of French wines, which a lot of people don't know about me. I know more about wine than I do about music.
Well, that says a lot.
Specializing in Red Bordeaux. But having said that, Alan, he likes wine. He's a fellow winer. And I know what we were drinking that night. I know what I drank probably every night of my life. This is how insanely complicated it is. And it was a 1966 Chateau Palmer en français. And we're drinking this thing. And I just said in passing, I'm supposed to make a new album for CBS. Would you like to produce it? And Alan, in his usual laid-back manner, said, oh, all right. And that was it. That was the extent of the conversation. I have to tell you that in this day and age, it would take half a dozen lawyers 3 months to set up an arrangement whereby a producer agrees to make a record with an artist. It took us 5 seconds. And it was done.
Never underestimate a great bottle of wine, then.
Yeah, 66 Palmer is a great bottle of wine. It's not as good as the 61, but it is a very good bottle of wine.
But it did its job getting you your next record producer.
Yeah. And in fact, actually, we still get together and drink wine. I mean, it's like after all these years.
Amazing. So the Past, Present, and Future album gets you to America. You get a spot on Linda Ronstadt's tour as an opener. On that North American tour, your keyboard player, Peter Wood, starts playing a riff, which you eventually write to as Year of the Cat. But before it becomes Year of the Cat, it goes through a bunch of lyrical iterations. Can you please tell us what some of those lyrical iterations were?
Well, the initial one was Foot of the Stage. The most famous comedian in England at the time was called Tony Hancock. I'd gone to see him in my hometown of Bournemouth. He played a depressed kind of neurotic character that everyone loved. I mean, they just absolutely adored him. And he came out and he said, "I'm so depressed. I don't really know if I want to live. I'm just very depressed." And everyone laughs. Now, there are 2,000 people in the theatre, and I'm looking at him, and my take was, he means it. I don't think anyone else in the audience saw it, but I saw it straight away. 3 months later, on a tour of Australia, he committed suicide. And I think he knew at the time that that was likely to happen. So I wrote this song, and the ending of it was, "His tears fell down like the rain at the foot of the stage." And, his tears fell down like rain at the foot of the stage.
Was the melody the same as it is on Year of the Cat?
Peter Wood had already written the piano riff, so the melody was the same.
And then the U.S. company, Janus, says, "We don't know who Tony Hancock is. Please try again."
Yeah. So then I thought, well, they're trying to annoy me, so I'll annoy them. So I wrote another version of it called Horse of the Year, which was about Princess Anne. And it went, "Princess Anne rode off on the horse of the year."
They didn't like that one either, let me guess.
They didn't like that one either. Now, but ask me why these songs' titles are so similar. And it comes from Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan wrote a whole series of what I call, because I'm a lyricist and I notice these things, I call them of songs.
Of songs.
Chimes of Freedom.
Masters of War, Visions of Johanna, of songs.
Walls of Red Wing. Yes, it goes on and on and on. Dylan wrote a whole slew of songs in his early... so I always liked the of songs. I thought they had a certain portent about them.
So Foot of the Stage, Horse of the Year, Year of the Cat.
Yes, they're of songs. So what I'm doing with them is imitating Bob Dylan's obsession with of songs.
And tell everybody about your girlfriend at the time had a book on Vietnamese astrology, and it was open to a chapter called The Year of the Cat. There's that word "of" again.
There it is. I mean, I looked at it and I knew immediately, well, that's an of song. I mean, I can do that. So I thought, well, okay. And Casablanca came on the television. So I just wrote down on a morning from a Bogart movie in a country where they turned back time. And the rest of the song wrote itself. It wasn't difficult.
But the drumbeat strains of the night remain, and the rhythm of the newborn day. You know, sometime you're bound to leave her, but for now you're gonna stay in the year of the cat.
So you said it in Morocco in 1975, which according to Vietnamese astrology is the Year of the Cat.
That's exactly right.
So talk about the role of Alan Parsons, because you guys had worked together on Modern Times, and then you come back to make the second album, which becomes known as Year of the Cat. But the production on Year of the Cat is so peerless. And here I have to editorialize for a second, because anyone who has listened to this show, knows how passionate I am about the subjects, who I've talked to and the music that they've created. But for me, Year of the Cat is the perfect pop record. And I will tell you why. Because everything about Year of the Cat makes you want to listen to it again, which is the greatest compliment that you can give as a listener. Play it again. Play it again. And Year of the Cat, like you said before, it's cinematic. It's a movie. Not only is the lyrical imagery, your lyrical imagery, so vibrant, and so you can just shut your eyes and imagine the watercolors running in the rain and everything that you are creating in this cinematic, piece of music, but Talk about the long instrumental solo section of the song, which is almost a minute and a half, where you start with the strings, into the acoustic guitar, into the electric guitar, into Phil Kenzie's iconic 10-minute sax solo, because he had a movie to catch, but we'll talk about that in a second. You know, I've listened probably in my lifetime to thousands of songs. And not that it's a competition, but if I'm on a desert island and I only get a couple, this is one of them.
Wow.
So I have to ask, as a fan, the building of the solo sections, from the strings to the acoustic, to the electric, to the sax, is that all Alan? Or is that you? Or is that the room? Who is making these decisions?
Well, I think all of us were. All the guitar solos on Year of the Cat were done by Tim Rennick, who toured with the Pink Floyd and is a magnificent guitar player. And what we did, Tim and I would sit down and we would just say, okay, what are we going to do? So the guitar solos, from my memory, were done with Tim and I just sitting down and saying, okay, what happens next? And then Alan Parsons is completely in charge of the sax solo. We got to a point where we'd done the acoustic guitar into the electric guitar, and Alan said, there should be a saxophone here. And I was totally opposed to that idea. I mean, I said saxophones belong in jazz. Saxophones just don't exist in folk rock. I mean, they didn't. They were about to, because Baker Street was on the horizon.
Right.
And Paul had done Still Crazy after all these years with a sax. But to me, I didn't want a saxophone on my record at all. I mean, I thought it was a horrible idea. Alan said, well, let's do it. Let's put it on. And just go home and sleep on it and see what you think in the morning. And I still hated it in the morning. But he played it to, like a whole group of people, and they all said, oh, that's great.
One morning comes and you're still with her.
I just decided not to argue the point because, as you said, I put it right as the last track on the record to get it out of the way.
But one of the reasons you hire a producer is there has to be an element of trust. And Alan, said, hey, Al, trust me on this one. And you did.
I did. And, but I don't get it personally. I mean, everybody likes the sax on Year of the Cat. I have never understood it, but there are things you just can't fight in life.
The public has spoken at this point.
I wanted Sand in Your Shoes to be the single.
It was a single in South Africa.
It was a hit in South Africa.
It was a big hit in South Africa, yes.
No, I never got the letters that you said you'd send to me. So it's goodbye to my lady of the islands.
Never had a hit in England because they never released the song that I thought would be a hit.
Which is crazy. You have never had a big hit in England, not even Year of the Cat, which only made it to 31, which unfortunately kept you off of Top of the Pops that week.
Yes, if it had made 30, I would be on Top of the Pops. It made 31. So that's how close I came. It's kind of shocking. No, it's done me a lot of good over the years because I was never a pop star in England. I've remained a folk singer. I've remained a lyricist, which is what I wanted to be. And I can still sell concerts out in England because people know me as a folk singer.
Right.
If I'd become a pop star, I would have lasted for 5 minutes, and I would be Crispy and St. Peter's or something. I mean,
I think that might be our first Crispy and St. Peter mention on this podcast. So thank you for that.
In other words, my career would have been over in a heartbeat. And because I never actually made the charts, I've remained, like a kind of a cult figure, I suppose.
That's crazy. And you've become a cult figure in the place you grew up, but you've become a pop star in the place you've lived for the last, 40, 50 years.
Isn't life strange? Because you can never predict what's going to happen. I mean, especially not in this business. I mean,
you really can't.
The fact that I've actually done this for 60 years, I mean, it could all have been over by the time I was 30. Right now, here's how crazy it is. Right at this very moment that I'm talking to you, I have more gigs on my schedule than at any time in the last 40 years. I have 59 shows on my schedule at the moment.
That's crazy. Well, we're all looking forward to seeing you. I've got to tell you that way before today, I've had an alert go off on my computer every time that you do a gig within 100 miles from where I am, because I'm sorry to say that to this day, I've never seen you live, but one of those 89 gigs next year, I will be there for sure.
Oh, I think you should, because I don't know how many more I've got left in.
So back to Year of the Cat for a second. Year of the Cat is your 7th album. And on your 7th album, you have something that you've never had before. You have a hit. So Year of the Cat becomes a massive hit everywhere except the UK and South Africa. But what is it like? You come to America, all of a sudden, the song is literally on 2 radio stations at the same time, where you're driving down Sunset Boulevard and you turn on the radio. There's Year of the Cat. You're like, well, that's swell. Let me see what's on this station. There's Year of the Cat. Uh-oh, I think I'm going to move here. And you ended up moving to America. You've been living on the West Coast of the United States ever since?
Yeah, well, I'm in Arizona now, but I mean, it's, yeah.
So after Year of the Cat, you leave your small U.S. label, Janus. You sign to the legendary Clive Davis at Arista Records. Clive's not like the other label execs you've worked with before. Talk about the homework that he gave you on the follow-up album to Year of the Cat, and talk about how Time Passages was written to a specific brief given to you by Clive Davis.
Well, Clive only ever told me one thing, actually. He left me alone to get on. He had no idea what I was doing with all these historical things. Whitney Houston is what Clive understands. He didn't understand me ever. But he did give me one piece of advice. He said, make a song that goes at 120 beats per minute with the saxophone on it, which is how Time Passages came about. Now, I must confess, I did something rather naughty. He said, if you do that, it'll get played on the radio. And I thought, I've got an opportunity for a joke here. So I wrote another song that went at 120 beats per minute with a saxophone on it, and I called it Song on the Radio.
Welcome, collecting the days, putting the moments away. You're on my mind like a song on the radio. You're on my mind like a song on the radio.
Did he get the joke?
No, Clive doesn't get jokes.
Funny. That's similar to how we started this conversation with a historical lyricist saying, I'm not the kind to live in the past.
I know, that's attempting to be funny too.
What's interesting about Year of the Cat and Time Passages and Song on the Radio is they all follow a similar theme, where they're all similar beat per minute. They're all similar length. Year of the Cat's 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Time Passages is 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Song on the Radio is 6 minutes and 25 seconds. So, but you listen to Clive and you had some more hits. So I guess that's okay.
Well, I guess it's okay too. I mean, I got a great wine story about Clive. It's a wonderful story. In short, there was a restaurant in New York City called Lutece. It was incredibly famous. It still is, because if you watch early editions of Mad Men, they're all dining at Lutece. I mean, it was the place that you would go if you could afford it. And Clive said, after Time Passages sold 1 million copies, he said, I want to take you out for dinner. Where do you want to go? And I said, Luchess, as you would. Everybody would. And I'm with his A&R department. There's the head of A&R, there's the head of singles promotion, there's Luke, who is my manager, there's me, and there's Clive. And I'm sitting next to this guy whose name I've long since forgotten. And the wine list comes over. And of course, they know I know about this. There was a double magnum of a wine called La Tâche, which is the most expensive, the second most expensive wine made in Burgundy. And it was, even then, I think we're talking about 1978. Even then, it was like several $1,000s. I mean, now it might be 50 grand, And the head of A&R says, order it. And here's the reason why. He said, Clive really likes it if you order something really expensive because it shows that you're classy. And I said, you're nuts. I mean, he's gonna go apeshit if I order this thing. And he said, no. He said, Clive will really like it. He'll really appreciate it. I order it. It comes. And eventually the bill comes. The check. Clive picks up the check and immediately slams it down on the counter and just looks away. After about a minute, he picks it up again and puts it down immediately again. And then after about another minute, he picks it up and actually looks at it. And all he said to me was, because he had Barry Manilow on his label, and he looks at me and he said, until I met you, I thought Barry had good taste. Now, that's not the punchline. Here comes the punchline. This A&R guy, he goes, the dinner is over, and my manager, Luke, says, what in God's name did you just do? You just totally, screwed with Clive Davis. You can't do that. And I said, well, the A&R man said that it was a great idea. And my manager looked at me and said, didn't you know? He's leaving at the end of this week.
Perfect. Love that.
Yeah, that's probably the best Clive Davis story you're ever going to hear.
There you go. Perfect. So you mentioned that one of your guiding principles of songwriting is to write about subjects that no one else has written about. And I've read that one of the ways that you get inspired to write a song is that you would open a world atlas at random.
Yes.
And whatever page you're looking at in the atlas, all these unique ideas will come to you. Can you give us an example of that?
Oh, imagine opening an atlas, say, for example, on China. I mean, can't you immediately see half a dozen songs? I can. The Great Wall of China, why was that constructed? Mao, Chairman Mao. I mean, it's, there's so much in Chinese history. You can't go wrong. I mean, I could... I could probably write 100 songs about China. Right? I mean, but I'll give you an example of one that I did. What is now an island? It used to be a continent, but now it's an island in the South China Sea. It's French. I'm going to pronounce it in English because it'll be easier for listeners. Kerguelen is the name of the island, and it's uninhabited. Apart from, there was a short time, and I don't know if it's still there, when there was a French station there for weather. They were studying the weather. Then I looked at the broader picture of the map, and it's at least 1,000 miles from anything, any form of civilization, and probably 2,000 miles from, any major population centers. And I thought that has to be the loneliest place on the map. So I wrote the song, The Loneliest Place on the Map, which is actually one of my favorite songs, oddly enough.
It's the loneliest place on the map. Nighttime is utterly black. I came here by some great mishap, and I can't find my way back.
I could do it with any country in the world because I've read pretty much the history of most of the major parts of the world. I mean, if you gave me an atlas right now, in 10 minutes, I could give you a song.
Wow. Which begs the question, are you still writing?
Yeah, I write for my own. I'm fed up with being in studios making records. I mean, I write for my own benefit, and I just wrote a song about Primo Carnera, which was an Italian boxer in the 1930s.
How, if you've grown disillusioned with the studio, how do your fans, how do we hear these new songs? The last studio album, I think, was 2008. So all the songs that you've written since, how do we hear those?
Well, you don't.
Tease.
For my own benefit, I write about subjects that I'm interested in. And I'm not saying I won't release another song, but at the moment I'm kind of obsessed with writing a book, which would be, I like nonsense poetry, which is Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear,
sure,
those kind of people. I have an idea of updating Alice in Wonderland to the present day.
Got it.
So at the moment I'm writing that.
Would you ever perform one of these unrecorded songs at a show and just say, hey?
I've already done 5 of them.
Oh, good.
On an English tour.
Yet another reason to come out and see one of your shows next year.
Yeah. I've got a, what is it called? It's to do with fish. My favorite poem by Rupert Brooke is called Heaven, and it's all about fish. This is a song which is about this monstrous person who wants to get rid of all the fish, wants to drive them out of the sea. And he employs a shark and, blowfish, it's called Blowfish. There once was a blowfish who wanted to be the lord of all water, the king of all sea. Most of the other fish, they leave him alone, they ignore him, but he can't stand being ignored. He has to be the central person in any situation. You know who I'm talking about, I'm sure. And he wants to drive all these uncouth fishes out, and he wants to send them out of the ocean altogether because he wants all the attention centered on him. So he enlists the help of sharks and other things. He says, go and get rid of all these terrible fishes that I don't like. What happens is that they listen very carefully and then they eat him.
That's funny. That is an unrecorded song.
It's an unrecorded song, yes, but I have played it in public. I wish I had the words in front of me because it has one of my favorite sets of lyrics.
That's awesome. So as we finish up, I want to ask you, we mentioned some of your collaborators. We mentioned Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones and Richard Thompson playing on your early records. Rick Wakeman famously plays on your 4th album, Orange. There's a great song called The News from Spain about a breakup that you had at the time where Rick Wakeman is just going to town. If you listen...
Like I said, I just did a concert with Rick. So
fantastic.
He knows more jokes than anyone, I think, in the music business. Rick Wakeman is the funniest person you're ever going to come across. He was impossibly wonderful. Rick is just full of this stuff. I love this one. This is one of my favorite Rick jokes. He said, I turned 18 and I wanted to go to a strip club. My dad said, you can't do that. You might see something you're not supposed to. He said, well, I went anyway, and I saw my dad.
Man.
A joke machine, right?
Last thing I want to ask is another collaborator, your longtime collaborator, musical collaborator, and co-writer at times, Peter White. Tell us something about Peter White, because of course he's gone on to have the most incredible career as one of the top instrumental jazz musicians of the past 30 years in America, but he started his career with you.
Yeah, I did. Well, we were recording on the border. Alan Parsons, because it's set in Spain, he said, we should have some Spanish guitar on this. I said, well, I don't think I'm competent enough I have a Spanish guitar, but I don't think I can play it. And Peter pipes up and says, well, I can play Spanish guitar. We had no idea. We hired him as a piano player. I didn't know that he could play Spanish guitar. He sits down and like in one take, I think it might have been 2 takes, he goes, and we're going, what? What are you doing? It's the solo you hear on the border.
The fishing boats go out across the evening water, smuggling guns and arms across the Spanish border. The wind whips up the waves aloud. The ghost moon sails among the clouds, turns the rifles into silver on the border.
Later, Peter told me, well, you changed my life. He said, I thought I was going to be a piano player. He said, because I played that solo on the Border, I became a guitar player. That is why he's a great jazz guitar player, because he played that solo on that record.
And to our audience, if you haven't heard On the Border in a while, it's on the Year of the Cat album. Like Al said, it's about the Spanish Revolution, and it features beautiful Spanish guitar by the Who Knew He Could Do It? Peter White. Al, this was an absolute pleasure. Wishing you well for the new year and look forward to seeing you out there live, both for your finale tour in the UK and your dates in America. Al Stewart, everybody.
Thank you.
Year of the cat.
My thanks to Al Stewart for joining us from his home in Arizona this week. Al's music has always been special to me, and I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. Really great stuff. For more information on Al, including upcoming tour dates, be sure to visit his website at alstewart.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another episode of Rock and Roll High School.
Rock and Roll High School is a presentation of Pure Tone Music. Produced by Pete Ganbarg, with assistance from Craig Rosen, Ron Robinson, Stefan Accardo, Joe Palmerico, Zach Kornhauser, Ross Owen, Elena Luvis, Claire Hudson, Steve Leeds, and Rich Mahan. Please visit our website at rockschoolpodcast.com for past episodes and information on what's coming next. All rights reserved.